I'm sitting here and I'm looking at just a lot of notes, man. And I don't even know where to start. But let me start at kind of how I got roped into this and why I'm so excited to be having this conversation with you. And maybe that can help kind of inform. This is the desire to have a conversation. I know that you're a brilliant lecturer, author, speaker, writer. I'm always interested in having just the conversation. I want to know more about you. I've heard your voice in my head because a friend of mine, brilliant guy, Jacksepticeye, turned me on to your book. I had just finished reading Meditations, and I'm going to show you this because I have an affinity for books, especially first editions. I discovered that was something that I wanted to collect, and I've been fortunate enough to have a few first editions. I've got some Kipling, I've got C.S. Lewis, I've got, and it became a souvenir. Whenever I went somewhere, instead of buying a little knickknack or a tchotchke, I would get a book. So I take great care in my books. And then I was actually in Glasgow, sat across from a friend, and I don't know if you've experienced this. You've experienced loss and what would be typically described as trauma in your life. But this was a breakup with a friend, and it had caused a unilateral shift in my world. Like my value system had changed because I'd placed so much currency in that particular bank. And so I found myself bankrupt. And I was looking and I was searching, and I was historically a person, if you said, have you seen that movie? Have you heard that album? Have you read that book? I would go, oh, yeah. Because my arrogance would not allow me to my hubris would not allow for any humility. And he said, have you ever read Meditations? And I went, I'm not really, I've done like some meditating and stuff. He's like, no, Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. And right then and there, I went on Amazon and I bought this. $7 maybe, Dover Thrift Edition, George S. Long translation. And over the course of the next 18 months, I poured over these 99 pages, and you can see it's marked.
It's well worn.
This is my favorite book, and this is my most prized possession that I've already inscribed. When I finished it, on the day that I finished, I wrote an inscription to my son, who's now 2.5. And this is my greatest heirloom that I feel I can give him. Is because if he ever wanted to know about his dear old dad, this will, written within these pages, is a lot. So that's how I went down this stoic rabbit hole, and it is a rabbit hole. And I've discovered this whole subculture and people. And I read your book, or I listen to your book, which I don't know if you actually have a preference between the two. Do you care, or because you did spend a lot of time, obviously, 8.5-hour audiobook. Do you care if people read it, or do you want people?
Work.
It is.
Yeah, it was harder than I thought it was going to be. I like it if people listen to it because I really wanted my publisher wanted us to use a voice actor, and we said no, like Donald can do it, and they were like, oh, well, we're not really sure about that, and then we kind of twisted their arm, and I was going to fly to Austria to go to Carnuntum, where Marcus Aurelius wrote the Meditations. And so we managed to get in a recording studio in Toronto, kind of at short notice, a bit last minute. So I had to do these mammoth sessions where I was sitting on a stool for like 8 hours at a go, just kind of like reading. And by the end of it, I had my luggage outside, and I just jumped straight in a cab and got on the plane straight after I finished recording it. So it was kind of a bit of a rush job.
What? I imagined. So how did you really record it? Probably in 8 hours?
No, we had to do a lot of kind of retakes and stuff because the recording studio that we did it in was picking up traffic noise from outside. So if an ambulance went past or something like that, we'd stop. And then there were a few bits that they wanted to re-record. So I think we did it all in all over like 3 or 4 days. And so we'd have maybe like an hour break for lunch, and like I'd be sitting there for 2 or 3 hour stints. And then on the last day, I think I did a longer stint. I can't remember how long. I think I went all the way through and maybe did like almost 8 hours. With a lot of kind of, can you do that again? Can you do it again? But Yeah, it was pretty brutal. So it was a good test of my stoic enduring hardship.
What is it that it was pain is either acute or it is long
Yeah,
lasting? What is it? What is the quote?
it's that's it. It's either acute or it's long lasting. He says the worst pain that you'll ever experience in your life is probably acute, so you can at least tell yourself it's not going to last forever.
Mhm.
And chronic pain probably isn't going to be as bad as the most severe you've ever experienced, so at least you can tell
Endure.
yourself that you've endured worse. So he said, whether it's acute or chronic, there's always something that you can focus on to help you get through it.
Well, wasn't it? Was it Seneca who? And I'm quoting you a lot, by the way, because as much as I have devoured and I had a tendency to there's books on writing that I have down here, and there's different books that I've approached the text as, and even we'll talk about a friend of mine who said I want the quick fix, and even the article that kind of like brought this conversation to be. Here's a 19, 20-year-old kid who's after 6 months had broken the code of Stoicism and said, here's the problems with it, which I love that take to be able to say, I've after 6 months of devoting myself to these studies, I've discovered a better way of doing it. Not the thousands of years that people have poured over the text and the even the 60 years or so that Marcus spent studying this, but the amount of time that I've spent, and I wanted to someone said makes the joke is like, if it took you 18 months to read 99 pages, my God, how long would it take you to read Fountainhead or Atlas Shrugged? And for me, it was if I didn't understand something, I wanted to pause. And there were days when I would read like 2-1 is one of the ones that I sat on for a second because it really rubbed me the wrong way. Begin the morning by saying to yourself, I shall meet with the busybody, the ungrateful, arrogant. That's like, to me, that is, there's the Manasutta, I think it is, which is the Buddhist prayer. And for me, that was it. It was like, this is what I need to wake up every day and say. I'm curious, you've studied this like exhaustively. Have you ever bumped up against something and just folded the book, threw down the pages, whatever it said, I don't agree with that. I stand in opposition to these tenements. Like, it just didn't hit you right.
Gosh, I mean, I'd like to say, that happened to me a few times. I don't think it's ever quite struck me like that because I guess when I first came to Stoicism, I did a lot of background reading as well. I probably read Pierre Hadot's books first.
Well, and I wanted to talk about
and then
that
I read
too.
the Meditations. Yeah. And so I kind of had a softer introduction to the classical texts. Maybe I had a bit of a modern introduction to it. And I'm sure there were probably things that I read at first that didn't quite click with me, but then over time I kind of chewed them over. And there's not that many things in it now that I would disagree with. There's some stuff about theology, and there's maybe things I would do slightly differently from a psychological perspective, but there's nothing in it that really kind of jars with me that I can think of.
Specifically Pierre Hadot, because the structure of your book is, I have to commend you, man. It's really fascinating in the sense that you begin with death and you end with death. You have this beautiful, I mean, the way that you begin with such a visceral, vivid description of Marcus lying on his deathbed, and then you, through the course of the entire book, not only is it just such a deep dive into the history of that man specifically, but also all of his contemporaries and his predecessors, but also how you end up death and view from above, and then what the part that I found truly compelling, and I hope that you will just indulge me as I just fawn all over you. The
I'm
very
interested to hear what you have to say.
oh my God, I have so much.
Go ahead. Yeah. No, I'm fascinated.
The very
It's always
last
interesting
part.
to see how other people react to what you've written.
It's been
So
visceral, man. It's hit me on a guttural level. And what's so funny is again, I started this book February, I believe March, because I was just ending reading Meditations, and my buddy Jack was like, dude, you got to read this book. I was like, all right. He goes, but listen to the audiobook. It's really good. The guy's Scottish, and he's just got this great voice. I was like, awesome. And being a voice actor, I was like, I'll appreciate that. And so I put it on my phone, and this is what I was going to do for my morning commute. If I was driving to set or driving to a studio, this is what I would do. And then all of a sudden it's lockdown, and I didn't go in my car for 3 months. And so this book just sat there, and finally I was like, I need to pick this back up. And so there was time that passed, and I ended up burning through the rest of the book in a matter of maybe a couple weeks. So it's very fresh with me. But the very end of the book is when most people go, that last page of the book is about the author, right? And you choose to narrativize that and expound upon that, which is normally like a little leaflet. And you go, now let me tell you I've told you about these men and this man specifically. Let me tell you my story. And I was fascinated to find out that here you were. Well, first of all, Pierre Hadot, you mentioned Pierre Hadot. You talk about in his book how Philosophy is the Way of Life is the book that I'm talking about, was almost the introduction or the root of your work. And the book begins, I was reading this morning, the book begins with a lecture, that's his inaugural lecture given at the College of France. And he's quoting someone who was given a speech 400 years prior. And he goes, each one of you expects two things from me on the occasion of this inaugural lecture. First of all, that I express my thanks to those who made my presence here possible. And second, that I present the method that I will use to carry out the task entrusted to me. That's Petrus Ramus, August 24th, 1551. He replies, or he continues and says, how, without being awkward or superficial, can I express the extent of my gratitude and my joy at the confidence you have shown toward me? For despite my election, I possess few of the qualities that would usually attract notice, and the discipline I represent is not among those in fashion today. I read that, and I think about how you end the book, and you talk about after the death of your father, 14 or 15 years old, I believe you were, you would intentionally get into trouble, just so you could be chased by the police. You just tweeted out, when lockdown is over, I'm going to get another tattoo. Any suggestions?
Yeah.
You're a Scot living in Athens. Yet you speak and you write about what is traditionally regarded as lofty, aristocratic subjects with a professional manner and voice of a wizened erudite. You are in many ways not necessarily a paradox, but you're definitely a puzzle. And now you're doing a graphic novel. So who the fuck are you, man?
That's a good question. That's the best question I've ever been asked on a podcast. Who the fuck am I? Well, I'll tell you as straight as I can, I guess. I've never really answered it this way before. But first of all, a lot of the things you've just mentioned, there's a bit of a story to them. And often they're kind of happy accidents, as it were, you know. But my father passed away when I was a kid. The thing that happened when I was a boy at high school in Scotland was there were a lot of teacher strikes. So that meant that we could bunk off school. I hardly ever went to school for several years when I was a kid. And we got bored. So I started reading books. And so paradoxically, I ended up reading some of the books that we would probably have been studying in school anyway. So I remember reading Macbeth, and I started kind of getting into philosophy. At some point, I read Plato, and for some reason, I had a lot of time in my hands, kind of like during the lockdown. So in addition to getting into trouble with the cops and stuff, I was doing a lot of reading. And then that just developed. I got more and more into it, and I ended up going to university to study philosophy. And so I went from kind of going completely off the rails and being thrown out of school. I was expelled from school, kind of yes and no. They waited until my 16th birthday. And then when I turned 16, they told me that I'd have to leave, because then they wouldn't have to transfer me to another school. So I got kind of kicked out of the school on my 16th birthday. And I was on a rehabilitation program for kids that had been in Borstal, like young offenders. So it's pretty rock bottom, really. And so it does seem kind of surreal to me that I ended up writing all these books and kind of traveling around the world and stuff. And a lot of it I'd love to say was because I was so focused and determined and stuff. And there's an element of that, but I had a lot of good luck along the way. And I think I was quite driven partly because I thought I'm screwed as a kid. I thought there's not a chance that I'm going to get a job. I don't have anyone to kind of help me out here. If I want anything, I'm going to have to work really, really hard for it. And so I always had this drive that kind of pushed me really hard through university and stuff. And I think that's kind of how I ended up where I am, but also because I have an element of luck.
You mentioned like pushing against theology and kind of that was the system that was I don't want to say imposed, but that was the one that was presented to you early on. I feel like everyone, and I remember was a pastor of mine actually told me that everybody reach a point in their life where they take everything that they've learned, every system that they've been given as a child, and they, almost like a knolling table, they lay it out in front of them, and they re-examine it through the eyes of being an adult now. And they either pick up the parts of them that they can own that no longer belong to their parents but now belong to them, or they leave it all there for good. It seemed like that happened to you as well. The system that your father did was this kind of the lens that you looked at that through, and that's why I specifically harping on, or not harping on, but the thing about pinging against the theological aspects of this.
Well, it's weird. I mean, I don't know exactly how to explain it, but it's true. I can look back now and I think my father was a Freemason. Most of my friends' fathers were Freemasons. And it wasn't some like big global conspiracy like people make it out to be on the internet. It was not even vaguely.
That's just a Dan Brown novel. That's all that is.
Yeah, it's not like in Dan Brown at all. It's a philosophy of life, and it's based on the Bible, obviously. But there's also weird strands of Hellenistic philosophy in it. There's references to Plato and Pythagoras, and the four corners of the lodge symbolize the four cardinal virtues of Greek philosophy and stuff like that. So I kind of, in a roundabout way, I picked up this idea, and for sure, like I've ended up embracing Stoicism as a philosophy of life. And it reminds me of the fact that my old man, my dad, had this philosophy of life, which just happened to be something that like a lot of people in my hometown were into. It's partly because Rabbie Burns, the national bard of Scotland, was born in Ayrshire, and it's referred to as Burns country. He's like our equivalent of Shakespeare. And Burns was a master mason. Everybody knows that. So our kind of local heritage has always had this association with Freemasonry because of the association with Robert Burns. And I'd kind of absorbed that and then regurgitated it in a different form, as an interest in Stoicism as a philosophy of life.
You specifically talk about your on your birthday, I believe your dad gave you a wallet, and in that wallet was the paper torn from the Bible, the verse in Exodus that says, "I am that I am." And I believe that you talk about that kind of almost became a progenitor for your pursuit for this.
Yeah.
What do those words? I have on my arm. You'll probably appreciate this. The Greek. I have the first and the last, the Alpha and the Omega of the Delphic maxims. Know thyself is written on my left arm, which is my non-dominant arm, my weak arm. So whenever I feel myself moving in a position of weakness, I realize that it's because I don't know who I am. And then the last one is, upon reaching the end, be without sorrow. And that to me is the goal. Cool. These words, know thyself, used to be something that I picked up in a Matrix movie. And now
Does it say that in the Matrix?
Well, the Latin version, tenet nosce, or whatever it is. The Oracle talk. I reference the Matrix far too much, more than it probably should. I've referenced the movie more than the Wachowskis do.
It's a great movie. But that's also a great quote. Socrates was known for really, embracing that quote. Gnothai siatun.
Is that how you say it?
Seauton. In modern Greek, we pronounce it slightly differently. Gonothiseauton. I believe that's how it's pronounced. My ancient Greek's pretty rusty, actually.
Oh, it's a
My
lot better than
flatmate's
mine.
teaches ancient Greek. She's just sitting near me, so maybe she'll overhear me and come and correct me in a minute.
I should ask you that this should have been my very first question, the most important question. Being in Athens, do you have a pair of sandals from the sandal maker? Do you know who I'm talking about?
I do know how you're talking about. I want to get a pair of sandals from him, but I'm scared.
Why?
Because I don't wear sandals.
In Athens?
I really want to get sandals, but I don't wear them.
Oh my God.
But maybe I should start wearing them. Yeah, I know. I've always wanted to go there, actually. It might be, I don't know if he's still going to be, he might not be open because of the pandemic.
That would be a tragedy if that was the case. For those who are not familiar, there is the smallest shop. There's literally only 2 people allowed, or 3 people allowed in at a time, because that's all that there's room for. The sandal maker, there's a picture of him making a pair of sandals for Paul McCartney and John Lennon. I have the Paul McCartney, and he's been doing this for 60, 70 years. The guy's older than the Pantheon. I mean, it's like it was built the same time. And he makes sandals, and he measures them for you, and he makes them right in front of you. And they don't look like his, because his are worn and battered and beaten up, and the leather looks so much better as they get used. So I was curious, because I sat there.
You're selling them to me now. I'm kind of you're making me want to pay on that.
As soon as you can. There's a hotel that faces the Acropolis, and we had one night in Athens, and on our way to Santorini, and I was reading the Republic while looking out over that and walking through that path. I'm so jealous of you, because you get to be able to and there's even pictures of you walking through there. These are where these men that you write about and read about.
Sometimes I stop and I think that.
Do you? Do you have those musings?
Yeah, I'll stop and I'll think. Often when I'm near the ancient Agora or the Acropolis, there's a lot of things that people don't tell you. I'll tell you a couple of bits of trivia. Please. I'll do my tourist guide bit.
Please.
So if you go in the Agora, there was a legend that Socrates had lots of students, right? And one of the things that he was known for was that he would do philosophy with anyone, right? So we know that he engaged in philosophical discussions with prostitutes, with slaves, with foreign immigrants, with rich people, with poor people, with everybody. Whereas traditionally, Athenians had tried to confine education to the elite, to wealthy or aristocratic Athenian citizens, right? So lectures were often given in the gymnasia, these kind of recreational grounds or sports grounds, where women weren't allowed anywhere near them. And there was only one of the gymnasia where foreigners were allowed. So it was kind of the exclusive preserve of wealthy Athenian aristocrats, citizens. But Socrates shattered that and went around doing philosophy in the Agora, which would be like doing it in a shopping mall, with a bunch of random people. And one of the people that he did philosophy with, according to the legend, was a guy called Simon, who is supposedly a shoemaker. And Socrates famously didn't wear any shoes, and neither did Antisthenes, and presumably neither did some of his other followers. So they were kind of known for going around barefoot. There's a famous play, a TV play about Socrates called Barefoot in Athens, incidentally. It's really good. It's got Peter Ustinov in it. You should check that out if you haven't seen it.
Will do.
Recommendation. So, and it's one of these things that you read in the histories and you think, this sounds kind of romantic, like it's made up. Supposedly Simon was the first person after Socrates was executed to begin writing Socratic dialogues. It wasn't just Plato that wrote them. Lots of other people wrote Socratic dialogues, but most of them are lost. And then the archaeologists discovered in the ruins of the ancient Agora a little piece of ceramic that had, and this is so weird, man, it's like someone has planted it there. I would love to have seen the look in the guy's face when he dusted this off. Like, it's got the name Simon scratched on it. And they say, I was told that beside it, they found some nails that would be used for making boots. So they believe that they found this thing with Simon's name on it in the ruins of what they think might have been a shoemaker's shop in the Agora. So that kind of confirms this legend that there was a shoemaker called Simon. And I'll tell you another really weird thing that we found in the Agora. So the Greeks have this place in Philippappus Hill near the Acropolis it's like a cave, and they call it the prison of Socrates, right? But it's not. Like they just call it that. It's kind of a tourist attraction. But the place that Socrates was executed is in the middle of what they call the ancient agora. And the archaeologists were digging there, and they found a little statuette that's almost certainly of Socrates. So that's really weird as well, because it kind of, and the Athenians seem to have done this sometimes. It seems like they felt guilty about the fact that they'd had Socrates executed. And somebody at some point had set up a little statuette, presumably in honor of him. It would be the kind that you would have in a shrine, in the place where he was imprisoned and executed. So again, imagine the guy dusting that up. I mean, normally when you're doing archaeology, you just find a little bit of crockery or something like that. But geez, that's a statue of Socrates. And this is the place where he was executed.
It's something similar. Like I remember Notre Dame is like probably my favorite place. I've got a lot of memories of Notre Dame. And the first time I ever walked through, I was 13 years old, and there was this very seminal event that happened outside. It kind of framed, we had arrived just moments after someone had jumped from the top. And at 13 years old, I got to witness what happens, then the futility of suicide and how the circle of life and just everything continues, because within a few moments, there was a new crowd there. No one knew what had happened. And so I'm walking into Notre Dame, this, famed Gothic cathedral, and I'm just I just witnessed so much stuff for a 13-year-old, and it's that passage of time from a child to an adult, and at the very end of all these statues of the saints that they venerate, one of the very last ones is Joan of Arc. And I thought that the juxtaposition of that is, here is someone that the church executed that they're now venerating. And it kind of reminds me of the same thing. It's like, oof, maybe this guy wasn't bad. Maybe this guy actually was more switched on than we think.
Maybe we went too far this time.
Did you have to give him the drink? Did you have to give him the drink?
Maybe we could have just given him a warning.
But see, those are the stories. Without those stories of him, of Socrates going, it's like that is a practical, whether it's legend or not, it's a practical example of someone going, life is preferred, death is okay. Or even more so, the Buddhist would say that, or Shinto would say that they're the same thing. Death and life are the same thing. They're just simply different stages. And honestly, both through Marcus and what you're talking, man, I really want to come back to your book, because there's so many things because you not only do you start talking about the thing that I appreciate most about your book, the historical context that it gave me, expounded upon, because obviously Meditations was written not to be published. It was written literally for himself. And I know there's a lot of conjecture about the manuscripts, and 15th century, 16th century is the first time we ever actually see these things surface. But regardless, it's what's being presented to us. And just as anything, we ascribe value to truth and to history and accuracy to history. But your book goes, okay, here are these tenements, and everyone up to this point, not to disregard anybody else who's written about these texts, but what you then do is go, here is the practical application of those tenements and those principles, right? Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, and the steps that I have now begun employing in my life. Number one being decatastrophizing my language. I was so guilty of being the kind of person, I am obsessed with this thing. I was devastated by that event. That thing killed me. And I didn't realize how pervasive that was throughout my language, and how it was framing all the conversations that I had, and understanding that the reason why I was doing that was because I needed people to validate my story. And everything that we do with this platform, everything that I am, the whole reason for this is understanding that we are all genetically predisposed to be storytellers. And it then becomes incumbent upon what story are we telling. But maybe you could walk just me through a few of those, or as you've been kind enough to do, to kind of extrapolate on some stuff that maybe is not in your book.
The techniques and the practices and stuff. I think actually that's one of the most important ones, and maybe one of the most relatable ones. Like this idea that we're storytellers and we tell ourselves stories about our problems, but we embellish them, we exaggerate, we distort, we focus on certain aspects. We commit lies of omission left, right, and center. It's difficult to avoid, though. We have to be selective. So, but we often leave out information that would change the meaning of the story that we're telling ourselves. So it's fine if you wanted to be a storyteller and tell stories to other people, but we do it to ourselves. Like, we're victims of our own rhetoric. And the Stoics realized that. They thought we need to kind of take a step back from that and realize we're kind of hypnotizing ourselves. We're brainwashing ourselves by using this colorful language. They thought we need to practice learning to describe things objectively by suspending our value judgments and our emotive rhetoric, like when we're getting upset about things or angry about things, and just stick to the facts. That's something that's timeless advice, right? And also, I think they relate it to natural philosophy, this kind of precursor of modern science. So I think they were aware that somebody who was studying nature, or also a physician who's describing symptoms in the human body, would try and do it in a value-free, dispassionate manner. And they thought we should try and emulate that when we're describing the problems that we're facing in life. So the example I usually give is a client who comes into therapy and he's given a presentation and he's very anxious about it or upset. And he says, look, someone shot me down in flames. They just completely tore a strip off me, man. And I just wish the ground would open up and swallow me. And then you say, could you just describe it again? But like just the bare facts, like in totally objective language. And he'll say, well, I gave a presentation and somebody disagreed with one of the things that I said. And you think, wow, that seems far less upsetting, right? But you hypnotized yourself into kind of feeling that it was really anxiety-provoking. It also reminds me of two of the shortest quotes from Stoicism. And so therefore, potential good tattoos. There are two that are at the opposite ends of the chronological spectrum, right? One comes from Zeno, the very beginning of Stoicism, and one comes from Epictetus. And I'm going to swap their order around, because Epictetus says to his students, and I believe it's me lega oimoi in ancient Greek, but again, my ancient Greek is very rusty. So he says to his students, do not say alas, or do not say oh no, or do not say what the fuck, or do not say this is awful. Basically, do not say alas. And then the quote from Crates that he said to Zeno when he smashed lentil soup all over him, and Zeno was kind of embarrassed. In the Ceramicus, next to the Agora, this happened. He was trying to teach him how to overcome his social anxiety. So the founder of Stoicism, Zeno, had this cynic teacher called Crates, who embarrassed him in public in the pottery district, this busy area. And he smashed lentil soup, so it was running all down his legs in public. And Zeno sounds like he was quite socially anxious at first, but it also sounds like he learned to overcome that. And Crates supposedly said to him, nothing terrible has happened to you. And that's a very short phrase, but it's deeply resonant, because in Stoicism, in a sense, nothing terrible can ever happen to you. But you judge things to be terrible. The terribleness is a projection. You've got you've just got lentil soup on your legs. There's nothing intrinsically awful about that. You can choose to view it as a catastrophe, or you could choose to view it as an opportunity, or you could choose to view it with indifference. But nothing terrible has actually happened to you. You've just got some lentil soup on your legs, that's all.
There is a huge...
nothing terrible has happened to you. Do not say alas.
Say this has happened. That is a deeply resonant, even today, this is dating when we're doing this, but literally today is the last day, and I appreciate your awareness of this. Millions of Americans will turn out to decide who will be in office for the next 4 years. Mm-hmm. And it's been really challenging for me because I'm in an industry, by and large, who your political alignment and your political beliefs are only demonstrated by the volume at which you profess them. And what I've discovered is that the main problem with this country and I think by and large the world is that there's a lack of discourse. There's a lot of and you talked about this with your the article that you wrote about Stoicism and social media, and how even you struggle with. You've been a part of social media before there was even a name for it.
I can't even remember. I've been doing it for a really long time. Yeah.
When it was just chat rooms. But you even talked about in that article how you still get stuck into arguments.
Yeah.
And what are some, because you're talking about practical applications of these things again. Yeah. How does that apply to social media? How have you found that to be deeply resonant, and how do you talk to someone? I had the opportunity to ask you this in one of your talks that you gave at StoicCon. What do you do if you're faced with someone, you've been studying this for your, 30 years or whatever. I've been studying this for 2 years. But there may be some people that you're trying to talk to that they haven't decatastrophized their language. They don't look at it as just lentil soup. They look at it as their world is on fire. How do you match that and bring that conversation to the same table?
Well, I think the first thing is your whole attitude. Recently I started to say to people, look, think about it this way, it's like in martial arts. Like if you speak to someone who's very experienced about it, sometimes they'll say the main thing to get right is your stance, which sounds kind of weird because you think, I want to learn how to do blocks and punches and fancy kicks and stuff like that. And you're telling me how to stand. Right? But a lot of people think, well, that's how you get centered and grounded and balanced and then learn to use all of the other techniques. And I think in Stoicism, there are a bunch of techniques that we have, but there are also maybe things that are more fundamental that define our underlying attitude. And for Marcus Aurelius and the other Stoics, one of those things is viewing adversity in a sense like a kind of game or as an opportunity. Marcus says that when someone's arguing with him, he wrestled, boxed, and did the Pancratian, this kind of mixed martial art type thing when he was a young guy. He also learned to fight in armor, probably practicing against gladiators. So, he'd done a lot of combat sports as a young guy. And in adulthood, he turns all of his experiences into metaphors for philosophy. So he says anything that happens to you or any problem that you encounter, and he's writing this on the Danube as he's struggling with betrayals from foreign rulers and things like that. These world historic events, the northern provinces had just been invaded by this massive Germanic army. And he's engaged in wars that are going to go on for years. And he says to himself, view it as if it's someone that you're sparring with. Mm-hmm. Don't take it personally if they scratch you or whack you in the face with their elbow or something like that. Just get back up and carry on. And next time, be more careful to get yourself out of the way. But, don't get your knickers in a twist about it and take it all personally, get upset about it. See it as a game, view them as a sparring partner, and think of it as an opportunity to improve your skills. And so I think, perhaps he's thinking, I learned this as a boy when I was wrestling. Now as an adult, I need to learn to deal with betrayals in this way, that it's an opportunity to exercise my skills as a strategist, as a leader, and as a negotiator. And if I never had anyone betray me or lie to me, or, it would be too easy. I'd never get very good at this. I wouldn't have to exercise any skills, but this is what I'm here for, to deal with difficult people. It's my job, I guess he would say to himself. So his fundamental stance going into it is, I'm not going to see this as something that's being inflicted on me. I should view it as an opportunity to improve my character. And so I try to view the internet that way. I see it as kind of like, like a gymnasium, full of exercise equipment and things. It's like if somebody's trolling you or they're abusive or they say weird things to you, it's just like something for you to practice your skills on. And, if you didn't have things like that happening to you, you would never get an opportunity to develop the virtue of patience or empathy or, to grow stronger as a human being. So Epictetus says to his students, if he says, you all really admire Hercules, and they're like, yeah, like Hercules rocks. He's like the greatest Greek hero. And he says, because he's talking to these young guys, and he's like, if Hercules had just laid in bed all day and never got out, he had to complete the 12 labors, didn't have to fight all those monsters and stuff like that, how could he have been a hero? He wouldn't even have been worthy of the name Hercules, he says. And yet you guys all want to avoid hardship. Why shouldn't you be like Hercules and be prepared to go out and face it, like in order to become the sort of person that you actually want to be in life? That's a paradox there. Why we have to sometimes face some of the things that the majority of people want to avoid in order to test ourselves and become the sort of people that we actually admire in life.
So then it follows that the blocked button or the removal of people, the removal of those opportunities to spar is actually not helping us, but it can actually hinder us, is what you're saying.
I would say that. I think there's a time and a place for it, though. I think I do sometimes have to remove people from my groups, but that's because it's not because I'm upset by the things that they say, but it's because they're I compare it to somebody coming into a philosophy seminar and jumping on the table and just screaming abuse at everyone else in the room. You wouldn't sort of think, okay, even the Stoics, I think, would say, would you mind leaving? We'll try to have a conversation here. Yeah. So sometimes I think there is a place for removing people if they're being disruptive in a group setting, but it shouldn't be because you're avoiding them or because you're particularly upset by what they say. And actually allowing it, like voluntarily facing these things really is your biggest asset, because over time you will desensitize to it. Like you'll start to feel there's nothing that, you're kind of used to getting abuse from people. After a while, you think it's kind of water if it ducks back to me. I've been called far worse in the past, so it seems kind of trivial. And there are many other techniques. The other one that's really helpful, Marcus Aurelius gives a list of 10 practical techniques. Mm-hmm. And these aren't even all the ones that are found in Stoic literature. But at one point he says, look, here's a whole barrage of techniques for coping with anger or coping with difficult people. And the other one I think that's quite helpful, they're all helpful, but one of them, for example, would be to say to yourself, try and think of the character as a whole. Now, I think this is a problem on the internet because you don't get the facial expression and the body language and the context. So you just get by its very nature, you just get a tiny little slice of someone's behavior. And everybody has off days when they can be abrupt with other people, or maybe you don't get the humor in what they're saying or whatever. And the internet is almost kind of designed for people to take things out of context, right? Because you perceive people through these little sound bites and avatars and things like that. And if you saw them, everyone knows, if you saw them face to face, they probably wouldn't dream of saying half of the things that they say behind this veil of anonymity. But also if you saw them face to face and you really knew them, if you'd known them since childhood, you might look at them and think, I'm not going to take that personally because I know the guy's just having a bad day, or I know that he doesn't really mean it like that. So you might perceive what they're saying and doing differently. Or you might think, I know this guy's kind of been a bit off with me, but I saw him the other day being really helpful, helping an old lady across the street or something like that. So I'm not going to hate on him, because I can see the bigger picture here. There's good and bad in everybody. So Marcus's second technique is to try and at least remind yourself that people are complex and multifaceted, and don't judge the whole of somebody's character on one tiny sliver, one instance of their behavior. But try and view them in the round. And even if you don't know any more about them, at least you can remind yourself intellectually there must be more to the story of this person than just what I'm seeing on Twitter. At least you can imagine that there's some kind of explanation for their behavior. This is more obvious to therapists and counselors, because part of the job of a therapist, coach, or counselor is to sit and interview people all day long and learn about their personal history and learn about the context for their behavior. So when I was a young guy, one of my first jobs was working with young offenders, kind of like my people similar to myself. And so I'd be working with guys, and some of them had done really horrible things. And, I wouldn't, take anything away from the fact that they'd committed crimes or they'd hurt other people or done awful things. But by sitting and talking to them and learning about their family and their history and how they got from there to where they'd ended up, it made me less judgmental. I could still strongly disapprove of the thing that they did, but I kind of understood how they got there. And whether it's ignorance or lack of self-control or impulsiveness or rebelling against authority or rebelling against the whole world, there's some kind of reason for what they did. And that makes me feel less angry with them, knowing it. I can still be quite firm and say, I really I disapprove of what they did, but I can also empathize with them and feel less angry about what happened.
Do you think one of the reasons why we're, by and large, afraid to do that is because empathy implies that there's some level of me that is putting myself in that person's situation and everything else. And if I admit to having empathy, much less forgiveness for that person or their offense, what I'm in some way admitting is that we're both human and I am susceptible to that same thing and it's reflective of me.
That's the next thing that Marcus Aurelius says. He says, remind yourself that, you've also got all the vices as well. And if you haven't committed some of the crimes that they have, maybe it's just out of fear or concern for your reputation or something else that's holding you back. But you have anger as well, and you have resentment, you have impulses. We all have the vices in varying degrees that we see in other people. And often we get angry with people, don't we, because of projection. It might be actually that we see more of ourselves in them than there actually is to be seen. Maybe it's an illusion and we're really just angry with ourselves sometimes. Or maybe they do possess some of these qualities, but they're also there at least in seed form in our own character. And I think that maybe that is a barrier to empathy, or something that frightens people. It would require a certain amount of humility and patience to really stop and put yourself in the other person's shoes.
I have by and large found that something that bothers me about somebody else is typically either a behavior that I once had that I will continue to struggle with, or I'm currently trying to eradicate. There's something that Marcus wrote in book 4 actually. Is it 3 or no? I'm going to find this quote real quick because I specifically wanted to ask you about this because I wanted to find out if you had kind of a similar. I just want to make sure that I get the quote right. Where is it? I'll paraphrase if you'll forgive me, and you'll probably correct me. Basically, he says, to do the better thing is what the goal of this is. And there are things that serve, there it is. Simply and freely choose the better and hold to it. The better is that which is useful to you as a rational being. But if something is only useful to you as an animal, say so, and maintain your judgment without arrogance. Is there ever a time when you just want to be the animal? You just want to say, look, I know that this is me just choosing that this is serving me only as an animal, but I just want to indulge. I just want to get, if I can reply, this is what I struggle with. I make this stupid move to look at YouTube comments, or I'll go down some Twitter that I was like, I have this whole thing drafted but deleted. It's some response that I send, and I'm like, oh man, because I wasn't like Marcus growing up. I was a weak person. I couldn't fight. I was skinny, and I got picked on. I got beat up. So what I had to use was my words, and so I found a way to eviscerate people and fight them with my words. And so I got very, very deft with that, and would employ the same things in good relationships and healthy relationships. That was my way to fight. So I still struggle against that. Do you still kind of have that moment where you're like, I just want to come back at this person with this fucking brilliant response that's going to cut them down?
I see, Stoicism really makes me think differently about it, though, and actually Socrates as well. Socrates was the first person really to say, there's something, you mentioned Plato's Republic.
Yeah.
I read that book when I was like maybe 15, 16 or something like that. And I didn't really understand what was going on in it. But for some reason, it just stuck in my mind, and particularly book 1 of Plato's Republic, which I think everyone should read. The rest of it is a bit more dry, but book 1 is a masterpiece in its own right. It was probably written much earlier. It's in a different style from the other 9 books. And in that book, they talk about this old Greek concept of justice, from the Greek nobility, from the Greek aristocracy, that says justice consists in helping your friends and harming your enemies. And this seems self-evident to Greeks, right? And at that time, weirdly, I heard someone else say that once, in the most unlikely of places. It was one of the recordings that had been made of Richard Nixon, and he was talking about using the US tax office to persecute his enemies, weaponizing it and help his friends. And I thought, that's so weird. He's basically, maybe without realizing it, paraphrasing this thing from Plato's Republic that Socrates goes on the offensive against and attempts to refute. Like, so the main focus, part of that book is just Socrates saying, I don't agree with that. Like, and everyone thinking, that's crazy. Of course, this is self-evident. And Socrates basically, through his usual roundabout route of questioning, gets to the point where he wants them to conclude that justice consists in helping your friends and helping your enemies. And there are a number of reasons why he wants to arrive at that conclusion. But one of them is that, like an eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind kind of thing. Yeah. He believes that if you really want to harm your enemies, in a sense, part of his argument, a very simple argument, is that harming someone makes them worse. So why would you want to make your enemies even worse than they are already? And although that seems like kind of a very simplistic argument, it echoed in my mind. So that now when I look at people arguing on the internet, I think somebody tries to hurt the other person with their words. They try to insult them or offend them. And then the other person tries to hurt them back with their words, or to humiliate them in public, to eviscerate them, as you say. But in doing that, you're just making the other person angrier, more irrational, more aggressive. Why would you want to create even more of an enemy? It's like we get annoyed with people because they're angry and hostile. And so what do? We do things to make them even more angry and hostile, to poke the bear. You see all the time on the internet. It's like kind of spirals. And people end up going completely nuts at each other. Maybe starts, with just a little barbed comment, and then it escalates into a full-blown flame war. But it reminds me of this remark by Socrates. Why would you want to hurt your enemies if that means making them even worse than they are already? You're going to create even more enemies by doing that, and bigger enemies. Shouldn't you be trying to help your enemies by reforming their character, educating them, helping them to overcome their anger, rather than making their anger towards you even worse? It's a crazy self-destructive path to go down.
I just finished watching this show for the second time, Boardwalk Empire. If you haven't seen it, HBO show. And I don't know if you've seen it or not, but for people who haven't, I won't ruin it. But essentially, a single choice made by the main character years ago sets about his path of destruction that literally causes him everything, or costs him everything. Mm-hmm. And it is an attempt to better himself at the expense of another person, to basically to try to destroy his enemies. And that single act is ultimately what brings about his destruction. And once we realized that, there was this great thing that somebody turned me on to, it's called the egg. And it was this kind of mind thought of what if there is not, billions of souls or whatever. There's literally one. And it's you, and you are everybody. And you're just kind of continuing to go through this existence as you live your life as every single human that's ever lived. And the purpose of that exercise to me was like, again, what we're talking about is empathy. It's like, and in the thought experiment, they say, that means that I'm Abraham Lincoln. Look at the great person. And the guide says that also means that you're John Wilkes Booth. Mm-hmm. That means that you're every good and every bad person that's ever lived. And to be able to go, what happens when I put myself in that situation of empathy? There's also, before I move away from it, I want to make sure that I remember, there's something that is either Socrates or Plato that talked about. There was a person who argues, speaking about arguing on the internet, I can't remember the word that is used, but it's a term for a person who just argues for the sake of arguing without really any point, or just basically to have people hear them argue. Do you know what word I'm talking about? I do not know.
Is it heuristics?
Maybe.
Could be. That was a kind of, I'll look it up.
please, because it's been driving me crazy. And I've tried to hit up as many writer friends as I can, and they're like, I have no idea what word you're talking about.
Yeah, like an heuristic is somebody who kind of indulges in arguments.
Oh, thank you. How do you spell that? H-E-R-U-R-I?
E-R-I-S-T-I-C. And philosophy and rhetoric, heuristic, refers to argument that aims to successfully dispute another's argument rather than searching for truth. So it's argument for argument's sake.
Donald, that is like 7 months of trying to solve that puzzle.
Did I win a prize?
You did it.
I win a coconut. Excellent.
Let's talk about this graphic novel. Mm-hmm. What brought this about? And you're jazzed about this, man. You've been sharing this on Twitter. Yeah. Like, who's doing your art? What inspired you? Why this?
What's weird about it is I don't really like working with other people that much, but so I realized I've always been self-employed. I like to do my own thing. But I'm working on a graphic novel. I'm like the Stan Lee. I write the script, and my artist is Z Nuno Fraga, who lives in Portugal. And so I have to work with Z, and we have to get along. It's hard because we're both kind of perfectionistic, and we're kind of have to iron things out and stuff. It goes on for a couple of years, the whole process. So it's a major project. So it's an interesting relationship, but you have to work pretty closely with somebody remotely as well. So I'm jazzed about it though, because when I create something of my own, I feel a little bit reluctant to but you have to promote things nowadays, and I do a lot of that, but I still don't really like kind of bragging about things, going, look at my book, it's so amazing or whatever. Again, it seems kind of very unstoic and kind of egotistical to do that. But the graphic novel, I'm allowed to do that because it's someone else's artwork. So I can go, look how cool Z's artwork is. I've got enough distance for it that I can actually get more excited about it myself.
Well, if I may, I just want to ping on. I want to touch on something you just said, because the impression that I've always gotten from you, I feel like you show and demonstrate the artwork for the graphic novel a lot. But I would push against that notion, because the thing that compelled me to continue to listen to you is not only the precepts that you were talking about in your book are so compelling by themselves, but you talk about them with the same excitement and passion as you do about the artwork. So you're like, isn't this cool? Yeah. I found this out, and this is how I applied it to my life. I don't find it bragging at all. I find it like, I found fucking gold in these hills. They're awesome.
I'll tell you what I want to, when I first started writing about Marcus Aurelius, I thought it's like the easiest job in the world, because it would be like if you told me, hey, Donald, I'm kind of into Elizabethan tragedy.
Sure.
And I was like, have you ever heard of this guy called William Shakespeare?
Yeah.
And you were like, never heard of him, man.
Check this out.
And I was like, you should check this out. Check out this Hamlet thing. It's really good, right? And I feel like that because everybody I meet says, yeah, I'm kind of into this whole personal development trip and stuff. And I'm like, have you ever heard of this guy called Marcus Aurelius? And they're like, well, kind of vaguely. So I feel that I'm just curating this most amazing collection of awesome literature ever. And, just kind of introducing people to it. So it's like selling something that kind of sells itself almost, it's it's the best job in the world in a way. So I do get quite jazzed about that. And also, it's funny because the thing that people always say to me is that they think I'm quite passionate about Stoicism, and I am. And people think of Stoicism as being a very dispassionate philosophy. But I would push against that. And, there's a sense, even in the ancient literature, that the Stoics were seen as being kind of dispassionate. But there are times when they resist that and they push against it. They say there are healthy passions. And there's a place in Stoicism, I think, for turning it on its head and just a different reading of it, that focuses on it from a different angle. And so Stoicism is actually, in a sense, I like to say, a philosophy of love. There is a kind of passionate Stoicism in the ancient literature itself, and we can definitely interpret it that way. I like to say to people, if you think Stoicism is completely dispassionate and unemotional, the clues in the name philosophy, right? It literally means the love of wisdom. And the Stoics take that very literally. They're saying it in Greek. They know what it means. Like, it means to be a friend, or to have affection or love or friendship for wisdom, as you would towards your dearest friend. And so, like, the Stoics want us to be passionate about philosophy. Like, they want us to love philosophy. They want us to love wisdom. They want us to really admire people that exhibit justice, self-discipline, courage, and the other virtues. They're not cold in that sense. There's an aspect of Stoicism that's hot, like, that's the opposite, but they want us to get excited about moral wisdom, about truth, like, about character strength. They just think we're focusing our energy in the wrong direction. And they do. Epictetus at one point kind of touches on this, and he says to his students, you do need to be a little bit careful about this. You don't turn into a zealot or something. But, he says first of all, you need to learn to master your passions. Like, but then, like, of course, ultimately, we want to be passionate about the right things. Marcus Aurelius at the beginning of the Meditations encapsulates it, I think, perfectly. He's talking about this guy called Sextus of Chaeronea, who's one of his teachers. And I think the histories imply that this is a tutor that Marcus had later in life. He was an eternal student, Marcus Aurelius. There's an anecdote about someone bumping into him in the street in Rome, and he had some books, and the guy said, "What are you, like, where are you going?" And Marcus said, I'm going to attend this lecture by Sextus of Chaeronea. And the guy was like, "Oh my goodness, you're the emperor of Rome in his old age, and you're going to school with all these schoolboys?" Because it was mainly something that young men in their, like, late adolescence or in their 20s would do. It seemed kind of strange to them. It was a caricature almost, that an elderly Roman emperor, not elderly, but he'd be like in his late 50s or something at that time, pushing 60, like, would be going to sit in a lecture theatre. This idea of him as an eternal student, seemed bizarre. But Marcus talks about this teacher, Sextus of Chaeronea, and he says he was free from passion. And it's just a quirk of the language that they use the word passion. They really mean unhealthy, irrational, excessive passions, the sort that you would do therapy on. They also have another word, eupathei, that means healthy passions, rational and moderate passions, like the sort of passions that you might want to cultivate. So we should paraphrase it slightly and say Sextus of Chaeronea was a man free from unhealthy passions and yet full of love. He says, full of philostorgia is the word that he uses, which is like brotherly love, philanthropic love, you could translate it as. So he says, yeah, sure, he's kind of overcome anger. He mentions anger, actually, and these other unhealthy desires, but he doesn't have a heart of stone. He's not like a robot. Like, this guy exudes brotherly love. And it's not a coincidence. Christianity was heavily influenced by Stoicism, and nobody ever Christianity as being a kind of impassive, cold-hearted Mr. Spock type of philosophy, because they get that there's an emphasis on love, loving your fellow man in it. But that comes in part from Stoicism. So I think one way of addressing that misconception is to say that aspect of Christianity comes from Stoicism, and you would never caricature Christianity as being, completely unemotional. So yeah, like, why would you think about Stoicism as being that? And there are many other passages in the Stoics. Seneca, for example, says, no other philosophy is as full of love for our fellow man. So, like the Stoics, Marcus talks about love in the Meditations far more often, by the way, than he talks about virtue. If you go back and look at Meditations, he mentions love repeatedly throughout the text. And so I think, one day when I've finished writing all of the other books that I'm writing, I've got a plan at the moment, like I've got a bunch of books kind of stacked up that I'm supposed to be writing. It goes on for about the next 4 or 5 years. So if I've survived that long, at the end of those 5 years, I want to write a book about passionate stoicism, and how, because I'm fed up with this slight mischaracterization of it. Yeah, sure, stoicism is about overcoming unhealthy emotions, but there's also a kind of positive psychology of stoicism. There are positive, healthy, rational emotions in stoicism that we should be cultivating. And this is the perfect time to introduce that concept, because we're living in a society that's ravaged by enmity and hatred and bitterness. this kind of the interpersonal side of Stoicism, the social virtue aspect of Stoicism, the cosmopolitan aspect of Stoicism, the emphasis on brotherly love in Stoicism, all these aspects I think need to be brought out much more. And, the other reason this is my hobby horse, and I think this will be an interesting point for you to talk about as well, for us to chat about. Recently, more and more I've started to come round to the feeling, I may be wrong about this, but this is my feeling, that ironically, I've always known that we say the three main broad categories of negative emotion in therapy are anger, fear, and sadness, right? And every therapist will tell you that most of the clients mainly present with either fear, anxiety disorders, or sadness, depression. But you don't tend to see that many clients who primarily present with anger, unless you work in an institution where they're referred by somebody else, like a school or a prison. Because people who are angry tend to externalize blame. So they think, you need therapy, not me. Why, when they're angry, everybody else is in the wrong. It's everyone else's problem, right? So they don't normally refer themselves, but eventually maybe their wife or somebody else that they work with might say, you need to go and do something about your anger. So it's less common to see people who primarily present with anger. They kind of fall through the net of therapy. And anger is a neglected emotion in therapy, but the Stoics are particularly concerned with it. It's the main negative emotion that they talk about. And I'm starting to wonder, for a number of reasons, if the stone that the builders rejected is actually really the cornerstone, right? If anger maybe in some regards is a royal road to self-improvement. Because I think it's easier to work on anger than it is to work on anxiety and depression. And I look on the internet, there's a lot of people, especially I talk to a lot of young guys that want to work on their anxiety, they want to work on their depression, and then they go and argue with people on Twitter all day.
Dude.
And they're doing nothing to address their anger. But they want self-improvement. They want to overcome the pain that they're experiencing, and dealing with their anger would possibly be a shortcut to doing it. Because the thing about anger is it's the most interpersonal of all emotions. And because it's interpersonal, it helps us to use other people for feedback. We're more likely to spot, for the reasons that you mentioned earlier, actually, I think we're more likely to spot our blind spots. It's hard for us to work on our emotions because we lack perspective on them, right? If I'm just sitting in a room on my own, thinking about why I'm so depressed, I'm too close to it to see. Right? I don't have perspective. I've got these big blind spots. But when I'm arguing with people, whether it's in a relationship or on Twitter, and I'm listening to the feedback that I'm getting from them, there's at least a glimmer of hope that the other person's perspective might draw my attention to the flaws in my character that I would normally have a blind spot for. And so I think maybe anger we've neglected too much, and perhaps it's actually a shortcut or a royal road to self-improvement. So I'd like to see a lot more attention being paid to that. And obviously, because it benefits society as well. Everyone's working on their depression and anxiety, but we're doing nothing to deal with anger. And that's out of all those emotions, that's the one that has the most direct impact on the world that we live in, the political climate and the climate of debate on the internet.
Well, one of the features of Audible that I love the most, I just discovered it, was the clips and bookmarks. And I was in my kitchen making dinner, and I was in chapter 7, How to Conquer Anger. Mm-hmm. And you talk about, you hit on this briefly where you talk about it exhaustively, but it's one of the things you talk about where it's like the same thing. Depression and anxiety are actually not the cause, but they're symptoms of anger. And the one thing that you said specifically was that anger there is this sense of injustice. I hope someone teaches that person a lesson. And then we harbor that. And number one, just all of the books that I've been reading right now, like I started doing East and West. So I would wake up with Marcus and then I would go to bed with Alan Watts, right? So I'm doing like this Zen meeting Stoicism, and the cool thing is that you start finding how pervasive the truth is throughout all of them. And the same thing can be said for Christianity, Buddhism, anything. It's like, oh, this thing keeps cropping up in all of these different areas. That's where truth is, because truth is not exclusive to any certain sect. It is pervasive and permeates throughout all of this. So the notion of, man, that anger and how Marcus, that's the thing that he wrestled with the most. He's like, I've got to get my shit together because I almost lost it on Commodus. I almost lost it on these people, the anger. But that becomes the root of, and I talk about, I hear constantly people talking about this person pissed them off so much on this tweet, and that triggers their anxiety. That leads to their stress. That leads to their depression. They have to get off Twitter because of these things. And you're right, it's anger is the match to the fuse of our depression.
Yeah. It's the most visible of the emotions in many regards.
So what do you say to the person who says, I can't control what makes me angry?
Well, first of all, they're wrong about that. So we'd have to, in therapy, I'll tell you what I would actually say to them, right? I'd break that news to them more gently, though.
Okay.
And this is how I'd explain it. I'd go, bear with me. It's a tiny, tiny little nugget of theory, but I promise it's only a little bit. Psychologists used to talk about the lump theory of emotion, and I think we can apply that to the lump theory of anxiety, rather. And I think we could apply that to emotion in general, particularly anger. So the lump theory is the idea that generally people in society, we are all, we're not very literate when it comes to expressing our emotions in general as a society. We don't have a very extensive emotional vocabulary. And some people have a very restricted emotional vocabulary. Maybe we think we are, but we're really not good at articulating emotions. And I'll illustrate that quite easily. So we talk about anger, we talk about fear, we talk about sadness. Those things that we're referring to, first of all, any clinician will tell you there are many different forms of anxiety. You know, there's social anxiety, there's phobic anxiety, there's generalized anxiety, there's post-traumatic stress disorder, or traumatic anxiety. They have a different form, a different structure, like they exhibit different characteristics. So we fail to distinguish between different versions of those emotions that we lump together. And that's quite significant because the treatments, the things that help different forms of anxiety are different. And there are different forms of anger that would require different or benefit from different forms of treatment. But we are rubbish at distinguishing between them. And even therapists haven't, gone into that much depth and categorizing the different types. But more than that, more fundamentally, each of these emotions is a composite. It's made of different things. There are different types of thought. There are different types of feeling and sensation. There are different types of action tendencies or impulses that are associated with these emotions. Emotions are complex. They're made up of many ingredients. It's like your anger is a cake that's made out of lots of different ingredients, right? And we just go, it's a cake of anger. And you go, no, it's like sugar and water
and flour and
flour and all the stuff that goes in it. And if you kind of put different ingredients in, you end up with a different cake, buddy, right? It's like there's a bunch of ingredients that go in there. And so like the biggest obstacle in treating many emotions is the failure to distinguish between voluntary and involuntary components of our emotional experience. So people say, I can't control my anxiety. And I would say, well, if you bear with me on this and you're willing to admit that your anxiety is a composite, maybe there are bits of it that you genuinely can't control. And there may be other bits of it that are totally under voluntary control, or at least over which you could acquire voluntary control. And the irony is that people will often be trying really hard to avoid, conceal, or suppress the involuntary components of anger or anxiety, and neglecting or ignoring the aspects that are under voluntary control. I'll explain that in relation to anxiety because it's easier, right? So when people get anxious, their hands will sweat, they'll maybe blush, then maybe they shake, their heart beats faster, they feel their neck muscles tensing up, all these kind of typical symptoms of anxiety, which are largely involuntary. I mean, maybe you can take some voluntary control. Basically, they're consequences of things that are going on inside us. They're basically reflex-like and involuntary. And so people will try to make themselves relax, or they'll try to kind of block it out of their awareness, or they'll try to have a stiff upper lip and conceal it so other people can't see that they're trembling. So their underlying assumption is, this is bad. In fact, it's awful. I need to conceal it. I need to try and suppress it. I need to struggle against it. But doing that usually just makes those feelings worse for a bunch of reasons. So first of all, like the more worked up you get about it, you'll usually just increase your muscular tension. Like if you try too hard to relax, you'll often just end up tensing other muscles. Like if you get overwrought about it. If you're really anxious that other people are going to see, if you think it would be awful if people saw you blushing, then you're just going to become more anxious about the possibility of that happening. And also it increases self-focused attention. So you can put your attention in different places. Like if you're giving a talk, normally you'd just be paying attention to the audience and maybe thinking about the content of what you're saying. But if you have social anxiety, you feel like a spotlight's on you, and you'll be thinking about what your face looks like and what your voice sounds like, and you'll be thinking about what you're doing with your breathing. So you're focusing your attention in a very unnatural manner, which will usually amplify your anxiety and make you feel kind of awkward. And so like this struggle against the involuntary part is toxic. We call it paradoxical. Like the more you try to struggle against those involuntary feelings, the worse you'll tend to make them, and the more likely they then become to rebound or recur in the future as well. It's like you're putting them under a magnifying glass, and you're adding to things by like having a battle with them or struggling against them. Whereas if you learn to accept them with indifference, this stoic apatheia, like to have indifference towards these propatheiae, these involuntary precursors of emotion, then they would just fade over time. They'd abate naturally. They'd come and go, right? It wouldn't escalate into this big struggle. So the first thing is learning to experience these things with indifference and not to view them as bad, harmful, or shameful, right? But to view them as trivial. But then also, there are voluntary components, like where you put your attention, to a large extent, is under voluntary control. If only because you can control where you're looking with your eyes. So if you're kind of like staring at your notes or your hand when you're giving a talk, that's going to encourage you to amplify self-focused attention. But if you make yourself notice how many people in the audience have blue eyes, you're taking more voluntary control and forcing your attention outward. So that can help to mitigate the effects of anxiety. We call that attentional training. It's something we do in state-of-the-art cognitive therapy for social anxiety disorder. But also, more importantly, you have voluntary control over your high-level strategic thinking. So the sentences, the conversations, the stories that you tell yourself, you don't control the automatic thoughts that pop into your mind. Like if you're sitting there and you suddenly think, oh shit, I've just remembered, or oh my God, what if that guy, he's looking at me like he thinks I'm an idiot? Like that thought maybe just pops into your head. Maybe spontaneously your brain just gives it to you, or maybe it's triggered by something that somebody says or something you see in your environment. So you have to accept that with indifference. It's too late. You can't do anything about it. It's not something you're doing. It's something that's happening to you. But what happens next is under your voluntary control.
Right.
Whether you choose to carry on a conversation with yourself about it, whether you choose to ruminate, as we say about it. That's the key word we tend to use today, rumination, or worrying are the words we use. So, if you have a conversation that goes on for like 10 minutes or maybe even hours about what if this happens, what if that happens, how will I cope? You don't have to do that. You could stop. Like someone could come and interrupt you. Someone said, I've got $1 million for you. You think, hang on a minute, I'll come back to worrying about
exactly.
So it's under voluntary control, buddy. If you had to, you'd stop it. And so learning to kind of switch off ruminative or perseverative is the other word used, sort of this kind of ongoing overthinking. It might be hard at first, but people can usually learn to do it. And the problem is usually they just say, I'm anxious, and it all gets lumped together.
Right.
They're not separating out the involuntary components of anxiety. But by lumping it all together, it's difficult to know where to start because you would use different strategies for different aspects of the emotion. And the same is true, I think, of anger. The ruminative parts of anger you can take control over and just stop. Whereas the involuntary parts of anger, which Seneca describes really well in his book on anger, you need to learn to accept and view with indifference, and then, do nothing in response to them. You need to learn to feel your blood rise. If someone walked up and spat in your eye in the street, you'd probably feel a reflex, like feeling of anger, like before you even knew it. You'd feel your blood pressure rise, maybe. And so you need to be able to experience that and just think, meh, I don't have to act on it.
It goes back to the sparring partner, right? It's like,
I'm not a wild animal. I'm a human being. Unlike wild animals, I can take a step back from it and go, I know my body's doing that, but I don't agree with it. I don't think it's a good idea to act on it. I can stop it now if I want. I don't have to continue with it. I can't prevent it starting, but I don't have to allow it to continue.
There was a moment, this happened a month or two, I think, ago. It was at night. We just put our boy down, and once he goes to bed, then my wife and I, we sit down and we eat. And I wasn't doing anything particularly active, but all of a sudden I just kind of felt like, I was like, man, my heart just feels like it's like pounding. And I've got my Apple Watch, and so I looked, and I literally watched as I was sat down. So I wasn't like moving around, but I watched, and my heart rate went from 78, 84, 93, 105, 115, and I'm sitting there, and in a short minute, like maybe 2 minutes, and by the time I got to, I think it was 135, I told my wife, I was like, I'm going to the hospital, and I literally put my shoes on, and I got in the car, and I drove. And I walked in, and it's the most interesting thing. They go, and what brings you here today? I'm like, I think I'm having a heart attack. They were like, right away, sir. And this is a time of COVID, everything. So I'm saying this through a mask, and I'm watching, and it's like 147, 154. And that's like if I'm on a run, right? Like that's where my heart rate, like 160, 165 is when I'm like a mile into a run. And doctor comes in, and he goes like, all right, we're just gonna, anybody that comes in saying they think they're having a heart attack, we have to do some tests. And so they start patching me up and everything. And I'm looking at the heart rate, and it's still like 140s, 150s. And we start talking. He's like, do me a favor and talk to me about, he's like, what's your name? I was like, Troy Baker. He's like, you're not like Troy Baker from this, right? And I was like, what are you talking about? I was like, I just finished playing The Last of Us Part 2. And he goes, talk to me about this. And we started to have a conversation. I was like, you're a doctor, and I think I'm having a heart attack, and you're wanting to know about a specific level in a game? I'm like, come on, man. And we had this conversation, and before too long, we talked. I was like, that was actually, when we shot that scene, we did this. And I started talking to him about it. He goes, and he kind of glances his eyes up, and he looks, and he goes, that's what I thought. And my heart rate has started coming down. And he goes, here's what happened. The second that you become aware of your own heart rate, it begins to escalate. Because like you said, you shine a spotlight on it in an unnatural manner. Yeah. And my heart rate went up. He goes, the second you even think about going to the hospital, now your body thinks you're in trauma. And so it skyrockets even more. He goes, by the time you walked in here, it was the highest that it was at. He goes, I just needed to get you to focus away from, he goes, I really did love the game though. But it's exactly what you're talking about. The second that we go, I wonder what that person thinks of me, we instantly, I've noticed this for myself, it instantly begins to, I feel that moment of emotional inflation to where it goes from being just a moment of like, that thought entered my brain to now it begins to consume me. And so being able to distance myself from it, and sometimes it's about not paying, we always think that if we're paying attention to it, then that is the healing. I have a tendency to think that way, as opposed to what I need to do is engage with something else so that I realize that it's not my entire world, that my world is not crumbling around me, because look, this thing is still standing.
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes focusing attention can increase heart rate, it can increase muscle tension, it can contribute to anxiety. But even more fundamentally, I think, is the belief that something is dangerous or threatening. The two things kind of go hand in hand. So when we perceive bodily, it's very common in therapy that clients will perceive the symptoms of anxiety as being threatening or dangerous. That's more common in panic attacks. I mentioned earlier there's different flavors of anxiety. The selection box of anxiety. Take your pick. Anxiety disorders. So panic attacks. It's more of the people find the heart beating or the feelings of disorientation threatening, and they think I'm having a heart attack, I'm having a stroke, or something like that. It's a misconception, right? Maybe they're completely safe. So they're. But of course, if you believe you're going to have a heart attack, then you're going to feel anxious. Your body's going to produce adrenaline, and your heart rate's going to shoot up even higher, right?
Yeah.
And you're probably going to start to feel kind of disorientated, and feelings of derealization, and all sorts of stuff's going to go on. You're going to feel pretty crap, because you believe that something really dangerous is happening, whether or not it is.
But that's the thing, that there wasn't. They did a comprehensive test. It's like there's no arrhythmia. There's the sinus rhythm of your heart is great. There's no danger. But I felt like I was having a heart attack. That was my reality that I was presenting for myself.
But if you were lying in bed in the middle of the night, it was pitch black, and you heard from another room a vase topple over and smash on the floor, like your heart would probably start to beat faster.
Yeah.
If you knew that you were the only person in the house, right? And then if you got up and looked, and it turned out it was like the neighbor's cat that had got in or something like that, right? Like, then there would be a delay, right? But gradually your heart rate would return to normal. That's the example that we often use in cognitive therapy to say our beliefs can often cause our anxiety. It's obvious in a case like that. But it's exactly the same if you believe that you're having a heart attack and then it turns out that you're not having one. It'd be the same as believing there's an intruder in your house, then it turns out you were just mistaken about it. Or my favorite example is, imagine you believe that you're late for a really important meeting, and then it turns out that your watch is wrong and you're actually early. So then, the thing that you were anxious about and your anxiety was very real, this turns out not to be real anymore, and your anxiety, probably after a short delay, will gradually go away because the thing triggering it doesn't actually exist. It's just a belief. But the same thing happens in social anxiety in a more roundabout way. It's more than that people feel anxious about how they look. And we call it fear of negative evaluation, that they're anxious about what they think other people might be thinking of them. But that could be completely wrong. So somebody who believes they're blushing might possibly be wrong about it. Maybe they're not even blushing because they can't see their own face. Maybe they are blushing, but no one cares that much in the audience. The thing that made me really question that, actually, because people are convinced that if they sound or look anxious, some people are very deeply convinced of that it's completely catastrophic. If I'm in a meeting and I look a bit anxious or something, it's just, people are going to know that I'm an idiot and I don't really know what I'm saying, and that just ruins everything. And I really don't believe that that's true. I think people are generally much more interested. Maybe there are some exceptions. I guess it depends on the context. But generally, people are more interested in the content of what you're saying. And many comedians, I notice, look really anxious, but they incorporate it into their act. So nobody thinks, that comedian looks really anxious. He's not going, he's not going to be funny. Or they kind of make a joke out of their anxiety, and it becomes part of their comedic persona. I used to go to a lot of comedy shows to kind of study the way they were performing on stage. And one of the first things that struck me was my clients in therapy keep telling me that if there's any sign of anxiety, it's like a social catastrophe. And I'm like, all these comedians look like, half of them anyway, look really anxious. They're sweating, they're shaking and stuff like that. They're kind of jittery and maybe they're taking some performance enhancing drugs or whatever. But a lot of them are they're showing all of the symptoms that my clients are terrified of showing, but nobody in the audience cares.
Right.
There's not a single person in the audience that thinks, let's go and see someone else. This comedian's sweating.
How was the show, dear? Well, the comedian was sweating. I was immediately taken out. There's a specific thing that we do every Saturday where we as a community, we'll all watch together. And if there's someone in the community that has never seen, it could be anything. We've done everything from Godfather to Ghostbusters. We've done Seven Samurai to The Matrix and Pee-wee's Big Adventure. It doesn't matter. The way that we choose the movie is through organic conversation. Someone will bring up a movie and then someone will say, I've never seen that movie before. And then we go, fantastic. Come see it with us. And how many people go, it's one of my favorite movies. I can't believe you've never seen it. I can't wait to watch it with you. The reason why we do that is not because we want to watch a movie together necessarily, even though that's a benefit of doing it. It's based upon the fact that for the longest time, I would never admit, the same thing we talked about in the very beginning, I would never admit that I'd never read a book or seen a movie because I was afraid, I was embarrassed to admit that this movie that clearly everybody in the world had seen, I was the only one who had never seen it or never read that book. I was afraid to admit that because I was embarrassed to admit that maybe there was something cool that I had not experienced. And the first time I ever experienced that was talking to my friends where we were going to watch Aliens. And we're like, yeah, let's all watch Aliens. I'm so in the mood to watch Aliens tonight. And we went to Blockbuster. That shows you how long ago this was. And we rented Aliens, and we were walking back to my house. And as literally the title screen comes on, I pressed pause. I was like, I just want to let you guys know. And this had been bothering me the entire time. Like, I was sweating. I was so uncomfortable. I was like, I've never seen this movie before. And the looks on their faces. And all of a sudden it went from like, hey, let's just watch Aliens to, I can't believe I get to witness and be here the first time you get to see that. And it became such a bigger thing. And so the notion you talk about is like, I'm embarrassed. And what if someone thinks that I'm blushing? And what we're actually robbing ourselves of is an opportunity to be in community with each other and have a shared experience that's far more valuable than just watching a movie on a Saturday, you know?
Yeah. There's an interesting piece of research that supports this idea as well. There's a study that shows that people who have very severe social anxiety disorder, so they're very preoccupied with the idea that they look anxious. But interestingly, other people who were asked to mingle with them at a kind of fake dinner party or whatever, and then assess like their appearance and so on, or to watch presentations from them and assess their appearance. Other people tend not to rate them as looking anxious. They're more likely to rate them as looking cold and standoffish. And that's because they're trying really hard to mask their emotions.
Right.
And possibly if they just admitted that they were nervous, other people would empathize with them. Wouldn't be that big a deal. But there is often the case, one of the paradoxes or ironies of therapy, and there are many ironies in therapy as in philosophy, is that the things that people do to try and protect themselves against their feelings often create far more of a problem than the original feelings themselves did. So the attempts that people make to conceal their social anxiety often are more harmful because they make other people not want to talk to them. They think, that guy seems really cold and unfriendly. Like he's not very approachable. Whereas, if you allowed yourself to kind of admit that your hands were shaking, you're feeling anxious, then, maybe people would not be that bothered about it, and maybe they'd be able to empathize. So the attempts that we have to mask our feelings and protect ourselves are often a bigger problem.
Or just even the notion of trying to go overboard. Because I was told that, and something that I feared about myself was coming across arrogant and pompous, and that I thought people thought that I was stuck up and conceited, so that I went overboard in making sure that people knew that I wasn't those things, and ended up, of course, coming across arrogant and pompous and conceited because, again, I shine the spotlight on myself as opposed to just admitting as like, man, I'm struggling with this. I don't know what I'm doing. I wanted to make sure that people knew that I wasn't conceited, and so I came across as being incredibly conceited and egotistical.
I'll give you a tip, Troy. I think this is something that helps me a lot. And I think of the best pieces of advice, it's one of the simplest. It's almost trite to say this, but it's helped me a lot over the years. It's just the idea that often people's greatest strengths are also their greatest weaknesses and vice versa. And where that helps me is, we all sometimes in life get quite hung up on certain character traits that we've got. And we're all individuals. Like, so, there are people that do come across as kind of more arrogant or pushy than others. There are people that kind of come across as a little bit more naturally aggressive than others. Like some people are more obsessed with work. Some people are much more laid back. Everyone's got their own personality. And, sometimes we give each other a hard time over our personality traits, right? And what works really well in one context, like the quality that make you a really good drill sergeant in the army, might not be good qualities when it comes to cultivating domestic bliss in your marriage or playing with your kids, right? So qualities that are an asset in one situation can be a handicap in another situation, and vice versa. But knowing that, like making that your philosophy of life, I think allows you to be much more forgiving towards yourself and towards other people. Like, and it also helps us to be more creative in thinking, like, if I'm doing something and it's really bugging my flatmate or my girlfriend or my kid or whatever, you know, rather than just kind of feeling bad about it, I might think, yeah, but, you know, does this quality actually work in some situations? You know, maybe there are good and bad sides to it. Like, otherwise, I think we set ourselves up for getting into a struggle with our own personality traits. And some of those traits can be changed, and other ones we need to kind of massage more gently, you know, and deploy more strategically rather than just trying to lobotomize ourselves and remove chunks of our personality. But I think it allows us to be less tough on ourselves if we, you know, and more forgiving towards ourselves if we can think, look, this trait that I've got that annoys some people or backfires in some situations, you know, maybe I do need to change it there, but maybe it actually works quite well for me in other situations.
You've got a lot
and that's okay.
Like you said, you've got a lot of books lined up. And I know that, I mean, it sounds to me like if you have the next 4 to 5 years of books lined up for you to write, it sounds like I've got the next 4 to 5 years of books lined up for me to read. Is the graphic novel going to come out first of those?
Yeah.
Or when do you see that being done?
Kind of halfway through, and I think it'll maybe come out late next year. So I'm quite excited.
What do you want to accomplish by that? And something, it's obviously a completely different thing, but so much of it is tied within our, are you wanting to, is it reaching a different group of people? Is it telling the story in a different way? What is the point of the graphic novel for you?
Like I said earlier, like it was one of the things that happened by accident, right? So at no point, I barely read any graphic novels, right? I mean, I think I can safely get away with saying that now. I made a point of not mentioning that to my publisher at the time.
I was going to say, as a Scot, you come from a long lineage because you got Grant Morrison, you got Mark Millar that are, you know, very accomplished Scottish comic book writers.
I used to read 2000 AD religiously, but when I was like a schoolboy, right? Probably when I was bunking off school all that time,
right?
I'd be reading Judge Dredd and Nemesis the Warlock and all that. So I had a really good schooling, like in comic books. And like pretty serious kind of sort of like more adult comics that are sort of precursors of graphic novels. And but then after that, I hadn't really, you know, I do a lot of reading for my work, like researching philosophy and psychology. So I tend not in my leisure time to want to sit down with another book, right?
Sure.
I watch movies and things. So it's been a long time since I read a graphic novel. And so I had no intention whatsoever, zero intention to write a graphic novel. But it happened by chance, right? I spoke to this guy, just messaged me on the internet, and he'd been illustrating a play by Aristophanes, Z, in Portugal. And I forgot about it for like 6 months or something. And then for some reason, one day I thought, I could get that guy just to do a couple of little web comics, and you know, maybe I could use those to promote my courses or something. It would be cool to do that just for like fun. I can think of a couple of cool little vignettes, little stories that he could do. So we did that, and then by chance, I was speaking at a conference in London, and I was going to try and print some flyers, and for some weird reason, like I just could not find a printer that would do these flyers for me. And I was running out of time. It was like the day before the conference. And I walked in a shop, and I said to this guy in a tile shop, do you know if there's a printer near here? And he says, there's a shop round the corner called War. It's run by this weird guy from the north of England. I think he's some kind of artist or something. He does some kind of printing. So I thought, it's better than nothing. So I went around sure enough a shop, and the guy was an artist, and he said, we do this thing called giclée printing. It's like high quality printing that you would hang on your wall. And I said, that's not used to me, buddy. Like, you know, I'll continue the quest for, you know, a high street print. I couldn't find one. So I was sitting there having a coffee, and I thought, I'm just going to go back to that guy's shop and say, could you just print me like 3 of these panels from these little web comics? So I did that, and I put them out at the conference, and I forgot that a lot of people that work in the publishing industry attend these things. And so there was a guy there who was a senior editor, and he said, where did this artwork come from? And we got in a conversation about doing a graphic novel, and then it kind of developed from there. So I had no plan to do a graphic novel. It was just a series of kind of chance occurrences. One of them being that I couldn't find a printer. I just stumbled into like putting these things on a display, and a guy saying, do you want to do a graphic novel? And so now it's like a big project that we're in the middle of doing. And I went off and I read a bunch of graphic novels. There's a surprising number of books about how to do graphic novels. So Scott McCloud's Making Comics. It's like awesome.
Great.
I read that cover to cover twice right at the beginning. And so I kind of got more and more into it. And I was interested in it because I thought, if you immerse yourself in this, do I learn more about Marcus Aurelius by like actually trying to visualize his life? And it did, I think, in some ways change my perception of the story of his life. But now I think more about, is it going to reach another audience? And I guess the surprise there for me would be, earlier this year, I went to the Marine Corps University and I spoke to the US Marines. And not long ago, actually, I did a video conference for the US Army. You know, a lot of the guys in the military that I speak to are super excited about the graphic novel idea for some reason. It just seems to resonate with them. The Marines have got their own graphic novel. Like some of the guys, like in the Marine Corps, did the artwork and the stories for, because they're really into this idea of finding innovative teaching methods. So they thought, well, let's try graphic novels because maybe it's a good way of kind of getting ideas across and making it more interesting. So it's not, you know, it's not as dry, it's not as boring. So I hadn't thought about that before, but for some reason it seems to resonate with the military. Maybe it will reach a younger audience. I have to keep explaining to people. There's a lot of people that say, I'm going to buy this for my wee girl and read it with her. And I'm like, well, you should know that there's a lot of nudity and some crucifixion scenes in it and stuff like that. And a lot of people die from the plague. So the editor that we've got, Casey Pierce, who is kind of helping us out as a freelance editor. She's really into horror. So I brought her on because as I was writing it, I thought there are big chunks of this story that are like a horror story that I had never really thought of it before. You read the books and you read Marcus Aurelius, there was this plague, 5 million people died, and then you turn the page and you think, that's interesting. Anyway, what else did Marcus Aurelius say? Right. But when you visualize the story, you think, no, they're still dying. They're chapter 8, not chapter 9. No, they're still dying in the plague everywhere. Yeah. And it's quite visual.
His entire family, right? Save one person.
Would lose their sight, they'd lose fingers, their bodies were covered in scabs. So if you picture it on the screen or on the page, it's like, it's more obvious that he was surrounded by death. Yeah, he lost. There are a lot of funerals in the story. A lot of people die. It's kind of like 3 weddings, and I feel there's like 3 funerals and a wedding in it, I think. We wanted to avoid, when we started doing it, I thought, okay, we don't want a bunch of guys in togas and sandals just talking to each other, right? Because I read some graphic novels and I was amazed that some of them were just like talking heads. But some people quite like that style, but I was like, no. Maybe because I read Stan Lee's book first, and he said he's not the best guy to write in comic scripts, I think. But he would have admitted that too. Yeah, like he was. He goes on a lot about just kind of like getting things done quickly and stuff. But he, one of the things he says is that he used to ask himself, if you removed all the dialogue from a story, would you still be able to figure out roughly what's happening? Because he really believed in putting a lot of action on the page, and so like that's a high bar to set, but nevertheless we kind of thought, could we try and get more action and more variety? We've ended up with is from 2 guys in togas talking to each other. Like we put a lot of effort into changing locations, like, you know, having more interesting characters. And I was Z will tell you, the most excited that I got was when we did tons of research on this. And one day in my kind of rabbit hole of research, I discovered that Scythians tattooed their babies. And I was like, we need a tattooed baby in the graphic novel. Like, who doesn't like, you
Yes.
can never have too many tattooed babies. So I was like, that has to go in the graphic. So we were kind of looking for stuff in the histories that people wouldn't believe. There's going to have to be like a sort of disclaimer at the beginning of this that says the stuff in this graphic novel that you think, no way, like, is all the stuff that's taken directly from the historical research that we did. So there's like stuff in it that I think people are going to be like, that didn't exist. Like, is that a thing that happened? Like, it has to go in the graphic novel. So we tried to have a lot of interesting visual content and to kind of get as much philosophy. So I went on a trip of really looking at the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius and really trying to connect the stuff that he said to things in his environment or events in his life. And it's odd because there's something very strange about the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. You mentioned earlier Meditations 2.1, which is probably the most widely quoted passage in the book. It's the beginning of the main part of the book. He also says, each morning say to yourself, and the original manuscript was entitled to himself. And so this phrase, to yourself, say to yourself, recurs throughout the book, but it's there at the beginning of book 2. And book 1 is sometimes believed to have been written at a later date. It's sort of a preface in a way. So book 2 is the beginning of the main chunk of the book, and it opens by saying, say to yourself each morning. It's odd, he says, you will meet traitors, meddlesome people, people that are deceitful. It's weirdly abstract, right? He does occasionally mention other people, but in a kind of vague and fleeting way. He doesn't connect most of these remarks to the historical events that are going on around him. So if you're at Carnuntum or you just try and visualize it in the novel, you think, it's strange that he's writing this on the Danube frontier in a military base. And yet when you read it, you might think, each morning tell yourself that you'll meet meddlesome and troublesome. You might think, that sounds like my mother-in-law. Or there's a guy that works next to me in the office that's a bit like that. Because you can project, people love it. It's timeless because people project themselves into the book, but it's odd that he wrote it in this weirdly anonymized way.
Yeah.
And so there's a process that you can go through of going, who might he have been talking about there? Well, he faced a civil war, so he knows a lot about betrayal and treachery. The Romans call the Germanic invasion a conspiracy. That's the word that they use for it, because the people that invaded them, they had peace treaties with, and they conspired and violated those treaties and invaded the northern provinces. So he would have seen that as client kings, people that should have been his allies, invading and declaring a war on the Roman Empire when the legions were ravaged by the plague, when they were on their knees, as it were. So when you put it in its historical context, you imagine him writing that in Carnuntum, surrounded by Germanic people and his officers and diplomats from foreign tribes, then it might be that he's talking about something his wife said to him the other day.
Right.
Or it might be that he's talking about these world historic shaping betrayals, like the Shakespearean level of drama that's unfolding around him. So it was kind of a bit of a trip, just really trying to connect these things. Even things like he says, at one point in the Meditations, he says, look, getting annoyed with bad people or foolish people for doing bad and foolish things would be like getting annoyed with babies for crying or getting annoyed with horses for neighing. You go to Carnuntum, you realize there were thousands of Roman cavalry stationed there. So I can imagine that sometimes the sound of horses might have been deafening, and Marcus might have been sitting there thinking, geez, man, I'm trying to concentrate and there's all these horses outside. And, he says to become attached to material things, external things, would be like setting your heart on a little bird that's nestled by the riverside, and before you know it, it's flitted off into the distance and disappeared. So he says material things are transient, just like and when you go to Carnuntum, there are loads and loads of little sparrows that nest in the hedgerows along the side of the river. And so, I kind of think there's this whole story that emerges by just visualizing what he might be referring to. And then, we can have a lot of fun in the graphic novel, kind of thinking, when he's referring to, he says at one point, I'll tell you something that's actually in the graphic novel. It's a spoiler alert, but it's not much of a spoiler. Like he says, and there's a famous passage where he says, "Look, the art of life is more like wrestling than like dancing, because you need to brace yourself for impact." So we have him as a young guy, as an adolescent, wrestling. And we've got his wrestling master saying to him, "Hey, Marcus, are you dancing with that guy or wrestling him?" And kind of like alluding to the sort of the gestation of these metaphors in his mind. He also led a dancing troupe. There's a lot of things about Marcus that people don't realize until you actually visualize it. But he was a kind of a Renaissance man. He did a lot of things. He studied painting. And then his interest, it was this painting master that introduced him to philosophy. So we have that, they're standing painting and they're kind of philosophizing about visual aesthetics and, what it means to find beauty. And there's a passage in the Meditations where he says, even the cracks on the face of an elderly man or woman can be perceived as beautiful from a certain perspective. So we imagine that he's having that conversation with Diognetus, who was his painting master. We think it would make sense if this guy who introduced him to philosophy, who was meant to be teaching him painting, was where he got this passage from. So we try and kind of tie things into the specific events in his life and the individuals that he knew.
What a fascinating concept.
I think one of the things that comes out of it overall, though, is that there are many reasons why Marcus talked a lot about death. It's just a Stoic preoccupation. But when you really try and visualize his life story, I think it's obvious that he must have opened his eyes every morning and thought, am I still alive?
Yeah.
Like, I could have been assassinated, died of plague, had my throat slit by like a barbarian horde overrunning the foot. He must have been constantly feeling like his life was on a razor's edge. He watched so many people around him dying, his own family, but also his friends and officers in the military that were with him and so on. So I think he must have had a very immediate sense of his own mortality.
There's no sense of, I know that, when it's not like the last page that he wrote and then the next day he died, but my favorite, the way that he closes, the way that the book closes, is very almost foreshadowing that this could have been his last. He says, "I have not played my 5 acts," or it's a praetor may have employed an actor, dismisses him from the stage, should the actor be upset about this, "but I've not played my 5 acts, but only 3. Very possibly, but in life, 3 acts are the whole drama. For what shall be a complete drama is determined by him who was once the cause of its composition and now of its dissolution. But you are the cause of neither. Depart then satisfied, for he also who releases you is satisfied." And so the notion of depart this life satisfied and the end be without sorrow.
Yeah.
Is that something that you work towards? Is that where I feel like I'm so far, I can look at that progress bar and say, man, I'm like, maybe I'm 60, 70% there. And when I had my son, it went up. I know that's a huge question to ask as like a closing question. But I mean,
that's a great question. It reminds me of the book I wanted to. I'll tell you a little anecdote actually, and then we'll answer that because it's a great question to end on. When I was writing How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, I thought, okay, we'll write this story about his life. I'll have a section about different periods in his life. We'll go through it in chronological order. And then I thought, but the problem is the beginning of his life is really interesting to me, but it's not very dramatic. It's his education and stuff that we know about. And I thought that could be like the second chapter, but it's not very dramatic for the beginning. And so I racked my brains over that and I thought we need a radical solution. And I thought, like, he has to die at the beginning. Like, that's the easy, let's just go straight for the jugular. He dies at the beginning. And then we'll go back and go through the rest of his life in order. Like, and then I thought, that's a great idea. Like, okay, this seems to work. That solves that problem. And then I thought, but how am I going to end it? because he's already died. He can't die twice.
Mm.
And I was in the middle of writing the book, and I still didn't have any idea what the last chapter was going to look like. And I thought, I've really screwed this up. Like, it doesn't make sense now. There's not like a neat ending to it. And I kept saying to myself, like, he needs to die at the end, but he can't die twice. And then I thought, but what if he could die twice? Maybe we can have him dying twice. And I thought, how could we do that? And I thought, the only way I can think of doing it is if we describe his death again, but from a different perspective. And so I thought, okay, I guess we could do it from a first-person perspective. And when I did that, I thought, this seems like an odd idea, and maybe it's not going to be everybody's cup of tea. But one of the reasons I favoured the audio version was that I've done a lot of audio recordings over the years for therapy clients, like guided meditations and stuff. And so I thought, I want to write the last chapter so that when people listen to the audio recording, it's like a guided meditation on death. And so I would put it in the first person to make it seem more immediate, more personal. And I'd do it in a different voice. And so I did that. And then I thought, but this seems a bit hardcore. I can't ask people to do a guided meditation on coming to terms with their own mortality. It goes on for I thought people are going to be they're going to be freaking out when they hear that. And I thought, well, I'll try it on some people and see how how they get on. And I thought, no, they can handle it.
Yeah.
And they like it because it's not something they've really experienced like that before. They thought it's a bold move to say, let's get you to spend half an hour just really contemplating your own mortality like that. So I think it worked because it was a bit of a gamble. But again, it was a series of kind of, coincidences or accidents. So it sort of led me to think we're going to have to do this at the end. But I think it worked out. And a lot of people told me, without me ever mentioning it to anyone, a lot of people that listened to the audiobook emailed me or messaged me and said, I listened to that last chapter 5 or 6 times.
Yeah, man.
I listened to it, every day because they treated it as a meditation technique. So that leads me to this idea of coming to terms, meeting our end without sorrow. So this is one of my favorite quotes from the Delphic Maxims that come from Stobaeus, if I remember rightly. There's about 150 of them or something like that altogether. The Pythia in Delphi. I'm going to go to Delphi again soon. It's one of the most amazing places to visit in Greece, actually. Seneca says something quite remarkable, actually. He said that every night as he was going to sleep, he would tell himself, I might not wake up in the morning. And I kind of feel like Marcus Aurelius must have thought that, whether he liked it or not, because he was so surrounded by danger. But Seneca says he did this as a strategy, as a technique. And this is something that I do. And there's been a couple of times in my life. I was talking to a bunch of people in Toronto once, and I was wrestling with this idea, and I just sort of spontaneously said, let's do a show of hands. How many people in this group have had some sort of brush with death? How many people have thought, even if it was just for a few seconds, that maybe this is it, that you're going to die, whether it was because you were in a dangerous situation or you had some kind of health problem or something like that? And I think it was about half the audience or something. Sure. Maybe it was more than that, put their hands up. And I thought, yeah, loads of people, especially by middle age, or beyond, have had these experiences where they thought for a minute, maybe my number's up here. And that's happened to me a few times, where I've been lying there and I've had enough time to kind of dwell on it for a minute. And I thought, maybe I'm not going to wake up tomorrow. Maybe this is it. Also, when I was quite young, a couple of times I got myself in dangerous situations. And when I was younger, it was more just out of my own foolhardiness and recklessness, whereas now it's more kind of likely to be health issues and stuff. But when I was a young guy, there were a couple of times I thought, maybe this is it. I'm not going to get out of this one. And luckily, I was wrong about it, even if it's an unfounded fear. But for a moment to have that experience and to think, how do I feel about this? How do I feel about the possibility that maybe I'm not going to wake up tomorrow? It really transforms, obviously, your priorities and your whole perspective. It's a very powerful, very interesting, very liberating meditation if you have the nerve for it. But that's when you're facing death, unless it's instantaneous, if you have time to think about it, that's what you're confronted with is the question of how you feel about the possibility that this might be it. And that's exactly what Seneca tells himself to rehearse every night when he's going to bed. What if it turned out this is all there is to it? This is the final act. This is where the play ends. Like, could I look back on it and be content with it right now? Like, if there isn't another act? Like, so he, I think, was asking himself in part whether he could look back on what's happened so far and be satisfied with it. Just like Marcus is saying at the end of the book there. And, you know, that's a radical exercise for people to adopt. So I wouldn't say that it's for everybody, but, you know, it's something that I'm more comfortable doing now as I get older, because in some ways it's forced on us anyway over time. And we have these brushes with death, if that's part of our lives. Or if we see one thing that can bring it on in a roundabout way is you get older, you know, you'll see other people passing away. And,
Sure.
you know, when you have friends that die, or relatives that die, you know, then if you have any degree of self-awareness, you're going to think, you know, what if this happens to me? You know, how would I feel about facing my own death? You know, it should be a moment that stimulates self-reflection. And it's, people might think it's a morbid thing, but the Stoics, in a sense, I feel, were the opposite of morbid. Marcus Aurelius, in his private letters, we can see is actually an incredibly affectionate and good-humoured man. He's not really a morbid character at all. So I think it's a very dramatic, it's a very powerful thing to confront your own mortality, but it can also be very liberating. I think the main thing for me is it just makes me think it's more important to make the most of any time that you do have remaining, because the next day when you do wake up, it feels more, as the Stoics say, like a gift. You experience more gratitude for it. Like, you think, okay, maybe this is like, maybe I've only got one more day. For all I know, like, what am I going to do? Am I just going to sit on Facebook all day, or am I going to just go and, you know, bum around and do nothing? Or, you know, what if this was the only, if I only had one day left, what would I really, you know, what could I take pride in? What could I be satisfied with doing? So, you know, it's hard because all of us like have days when we just want to bum around and things like that. But it's good, I think, to keep referring back to that as your yardstick for measuring whether you're on the right track or not. Not what celebrities tell us or what the media tell us or we should be doing with our lives. But in that moment, you're alone. Like, in that moment, like when you ask yourself, what if I don't wake up tomorrow? It's just you and the universe. You know, we all die alone. Like, and it's that kind of feeling of like, what do I, in the bottom of my heart, actually think about myself, about life, about my priorities? And if I was given another day, you know, like in my heart of hearts, authentically, you know, what do I think I need to do in order to be satisfied with it, take pride in it? And looking deep, digging deep, it forces you to dig deep within yourself for your values, rather than, as we usually do, just looking around and copying what other people are doing.